Okay guys, we guys having a good day? Okay, next part in our solving quadratics by factoring. So we did the zero product property, right? And we did factoring quadratics. We did when a equals 1. So in forms like this, when a equals 1, your a in the front equals 1. And when you have common factors, is when everything has a common factor when your a is not a 1. You want to get rid of that common factor first. So we're going to factor both ways and then solve it. And you notice both of them are equal to 0, and this is very important. And that's going to help us to factor. So we need the right side to be 0 first in order to factor it and solve it. Okay, the first one. So when a equals 1, so you have an equation. So x squared minus 2x minus 35. So first thing is we're going to factor it. So we create our x. Right, we use our c is negative 35. Our b is negative 2. Put that in there. Then we write our two factors. So our two factors that multiply to negative 35 add to negative 2. So we can do different things like 5, negative 7. That one works. So it multiplies to negative 35 and adds to negative 2. So our two factors are going to be 5 and negative 7. And then we're going to write that out in our factored form. So we put two parentheses equals to 0. And we have x, and then we use our two factors, which is positive 5 and negative 7. So we factored using x factor, and now we're going to solve it by using the zero product property. So we're going to set each one to 0. All right, so x plus 5, set that to 0. X minus 7, set that to 0, because it's going to be zero product property. And then we're going to solve it. Minus 5 both sides, so we get x equals negative 5. There's one answer. And we add 7 to both sides to the next one, and we get x equals 7 is our second answer. So our two answers are going to be negative 5 and positive 7. Okay, for the next one, when we have a common factor, similar process. So first thing, we're going to divide by the common factor so that we can factor it. So first thing, right, we divide. So we're going to divide by our a. So everything has a 2 factor in it, so we can divide everything by 2. And since it's an equation, we got to divide the right side by 2 also. So everything by 2. And you notice it's going to cancel out, right? So now we have on the left side, we have n squared. Negative 16 divided by 2 is negative 8. So negative 8n. Positive 30 divided by 2 is 15. And then 0 divided by 2 is 0. So you notice it's very important that the right side is equal to 0, so that when we divide by a common factor 2, the right side is still going to be 0. So it basically simplified it out. So instead of factoring out the 2, we can just divide by 2 because we have 0 on the right side. So it's still 0. So it's still equal. So we can do that. So that makes it much, much easier if the right side is equal to 0. And now we can factor that, right, using our x factor. Right, if you need the x, so c on the top, negative 8 on the bottom. Two factors, multiply to 15, so we have 3 times 5, but on top negative, so you're going to make it negative 3 times negative 5. So those would be the two factors. So negative 3 and negative 5, because it adds to negative 8 and multiply to 15. So you write out our factored form. We factor here, equal to 0, so it's n. And our two factors are minus 3 and minus 5. So that's our factors form, equal to 0. And now we can solve that one same way we did the last one. So use the zero product property. So set each parentheses to equal to 0. And then solve it. So you get plus 3 to both sides. We get n equals 3. Plus 5 to both sides, and equals 5. So that's how we factor, basically really similar. Right, so if a equals 1, we just factor zero product property, solve it. With common factor, we just divide by the common factor first, and then do the same process. Right, factor it, zero product property, solve it. And that's how we solve quadratic functions by factoring. Okay, so using this, right, why do we need to solve by factoring? And why is it equal to 0? Why is that important? right? So these are called our solutions, right? X equals -5, x equals 7. But these are also called zeros. These are all zeros because we solved it when the equation is equal to 0. Okay? So that's why they call it zeros, and that's our solutions for each separate problem. So like for this one, why is it important? So it tells us where our zeros are going to be on our graph. This is so -5 here, +7 here. So our graph is going to have two zeros. It's intersect here and here to help us graph it. And because our A is positive, it's going to graph something like that. Like that. So it tells us where the zeros are. Okay, same with the right one. If it tells us what the zeros are 3 and 5. This is here 3. This is 5. So our two intercepts are going to be at 3 and 5 on our x-axis, which is our zeros. And our A is positive again, so it's going to be going up. Maybe something like that as a graph. So our zeros are also our x-intercepts. Okay, so if x equals -5, our x-intercept will be -5, 0. This is going to be 7, 0. Our two intercepts. This one's 3, 0. And this one's 5, 0. Okay, so going back to our situation, right? You have a person on top of a balcony or rooftop throwing something off the roof. And over time it goes and hits the ground, right? So the height over time. And you're given an equation, let's say it represents it, just for example. And you need to find when does it equal 0. So it's asking you when is the height 0. That's what it's asking, why it's equal to 0. So if you're to factor it, you can factor this, right? Divide by -1 to get everything. So basically you could just leave it there. But if you factor it out, it'll be something like that, equals 0. And if you factored it, you have x, two factors that multiply -14, add to -5. So we can do our x. So that comes out. So -14, -5. Two factors, 2 and 7. One of them negative, so 2 times -7. So we have 2 and -7, right? And multiply -14, add to -5. So we have +2 and -7. And then we solve it using the zero product property. So we set that to 0, x plus 2 equals 0, x minus 7 equals 0, and we solve it, -2, both sides, x equals -2, it's one answer, +7 to both sides, x equals 7 is our second answer. So what these two tell us is where our x-intercepts are, right, where zeros are. So it's going to be -2, 0, and 7, 0. Right, so this point here is going to be 7, 0. And if you extended our line out here, this point is going to be -2, 0. Okay? But that part of the graph is not shown because you can have negative time, right? But it just represents our shape of our graph. So if it intersects -2 and it goes all the way to 7. So you can tell the ball is going to hit the ground exactly 7. And if it's seconds, exactly 7 seconds. Okay, so that's why it's important how we can apply it to real world problems. Okay, next we have a couple examples. Here's the first one. So k squared minus 9k plus 20 equals 0. So first, we don't have a common factor we need to divide, so we can just start factoring it. So we factor it, say I put an x out here. So we have 20 on the top, -9 on the bottom. So our two factors, I'm going to do 4 times 5, and they need to be negative, so -4 times -5, so they add to -9. So you have -4, -5. Okay, so our two factors, I'm going to write this out, factor 4 equals 0, so we have k k, and then we have our two factors, which is -4 and -5. Okay, so we factored that using the x factor. Then we're going to solve it using the zero product property. So set each one to 0. So k minus 4 equals 0. And then k minus 5 equals 0. And then solve it. Right, plus 4 both sides. So we have k equals 4. And add 5 to both sides. K equals 5. And those are various solutions. Okay, so next example. So now we have 5n squared plus 30n plus 40 equals 0. So now we can see we have 5. And we have a common factor of 5. So you can divide everything by 5 first. Okay, so divide everything by 5 first. Divide that common factor out of there. So now we have n squared plus 6n plus 40 divided by 5 is 8. Divided by, or equals 0 divided by 5 is 0. So now we have something we can factor. So we can use the x factor for the next one. So you have 8 and 6. Our two factors are going to multiply to 8, add to 6, 2 and 4. Right? 2 times 4 is 8. 2 plus 4 is 6. Then we're going to write that in our factored form. Equals 0. We have n. Our two factors is positive 2, positive 4. And then once we factor it, we can use the zero product property again. So set them both to 0. And then solve it. And minus 2, n equals -2, minus 4, both sides, we have n equals -4. And those are solutions, -2 and -4. Okay, next one. Okay, a couple examples from our worksheet. So first we have, so n squared plus 6n plus 5 equals 0. So first we need to factor it. We use our x factor. So we have c on the top, b on the bottom. Our two factors of 5, there's only one, right? Plus 1 plus 5. And they add to 6. So we write our factored form. So we have n. Our two factors are going to be positive 1, positive 5. Then we solve it. Our two factors, right? We use our zero product property. Set this to 0. Set this one to 0. And then solve it. So minus 1, n equals -1. This one we solve it, minus 5 both sides, n equals -5. So our answer is going to be -1 and -5. Okay, let's do number 3. So this one you see there's a common factor, 3. So we can divide by 3, divide everything by 3 first, and see what we get. So we got k squared plus 2k equals 0. Once we have that, we're going to factor it. So there's no c, so if you did your x here, your c will be 0, your b will be 2, because there's no c. So our factors has to be 2, 0. Or multiply 0, add to 2, and they have a common factor k too. So when you factor it, k, and our two factors would be plus 0 plus 2, our two factors. But then they just simplify to just k parentheses k plus 2 equals 0. Same thing. And you also see there's a common k there. So you could just factor out the k if you want, because they have common k. So you factor out the k and put in the front. And you get k plus 2 left over. Either way will work. Then we solve it. We do the same exact thing. Okay, so I'm going to set each one to 0. So you have k and a k plus 2 in there. So I'm going to set each one to 0. So k equals 0. And k plus 2 equals 0. So the first one's already solved. K equals 0. Second one we solved minus 2 both sides. K equals -2. So we have two answers, 0 and -2. Hey guys, here's your joke of the day. Here's a joke for you guys. Okay, when did Mochi Crunch and Kakimochi fall in love? When the Mochi Crunch and Cocky Mochi fall in love? The other day. Ha! Okay, guys, shoot.